Okay, great. So we'll call the meeting to order. This is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Board of Finance, and we will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so we have a full agenda tonight. We have some action items. Request of one of our members. I think we're going to try to reorder the agenda just a little bit. Maybe Linda, you could make that motion.
Yeah, I'd like to move that we put the three items that need a vote up first. That's item 5 on fund balance policy, item 7 on the capital and general fund transfers, and item 8 on the private duty transfers. I have to go to another meeting, so I'm just hoping we can get voting.
I'll second the motion.
So the motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. All right, so we will readjust the agenda accordingly. So the first item up would be the fund balance policy. Maybe I'll ask Amy, but I'll just say that we have had this on our agenda, I think 2 or 3 meetings in a row, and but for the midnight hour last month, we might have finished it. But I think where we are on this is that the language has been reviewed and discussed. I think the open item was, what should the either target fund balance percentage be, or whether we should use a range. And I think what we're proposing tonight is that we adopt this policy with the range as it was presented here tonight at was it 15 to 17, right? All right. And so I'm not going to make a motion, but that's what's on the table tonight. And I'd be glad to have Amy offer any other insight or changes or comments.
Yeah, I think you pretty covered it. I mean, the language has been reviewed at the last couple meetings, and I think that we were just looking for consensus on where you wanted to be within that range. So right now, I think it's set where the 15% is the minimum and 17% is the maximum. So if you all want to discuss and let me know where you're comfortable, and then we can update accordingly. Great.
Linda, you had your hand up. You want to go first?
Sure. There were just a couple of little changes that we'd asked for previously that I don't see in here. In section 2, the second sentence should say Board of Finance, not the town, reserves the right to amend this policy, because the town as a whole doesn't ever write policy. It's the Board of Finance that writes this policy.
Excuse me.
And in section 5, we talked about, and I thought we had agreed, the very last sentence, and Lisa might want to chime in on this. This was her recommendation, that that we give ourselves 3 years, not 1 year, to restore the balance, just to make it a little bit, a smoother transition into that. And this is super nitpicky. In section 6, the top line, it needs a comma after the word allow. So when operations allow, comma. Is that where it goes? The intent of this town is
Yeah, that's correct.
For capital projects. Yeah, just makes it readable.
So I'll concur with Linda's recollection of our discussion. These were to have been amended in the final version from our discussion either 1 or 2 meetings ago. In asking Amy to prepare for tonight, we had just made the recommendation for the range and forgot to make those. So I agree that those should be in there, Linda.
So can I make a motion to adopt those changes, and then we can discuss the 15% as a separate issue?
Sure.
So I move that we make those 3 changes.
Second.
Any further discussion on those? All in favor of those 3 changes, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. All right, so now the open issue truly is the range or the target, all right? So I'd be looking for comments of support or lack thereof. Linda, you have the floor, Linda.
All right. Well, I know I'll get outvoted on this, but I do have a concern with the big jump to 15 to 17%. That's a jump from 10 to 12. I understand the reasoning behind it. The flip side of it is I feel very concerned about having taxpayers overtaxed and that we're holding large amounts of money in very low return investments, which is, sort of dictated by state law, how we invest this money. As far as I can recall, we've never dipped very far into that, even during major emergencies. And already Connecticut taxpayers pay substantially more than Massachusetts, like 50% more than Massachusetts, and 20% more than New York. You look at Simsbury, our property taxes are higher than all of our sort of competitive towns, the towns I think of as competitors for folks to move there. And it concerns me also that we're, talking about holding people's money when we have 7% unemployment. So I'm just not a big fan of having huge amounts of money held in reserves. I certainly understand the need for reserves, but I would be more comfortable with a lower level of reserves. It's not the only thing that Moody's and the rest of those guys look at when rating a town. They look at the ability of a town to raise taxes, and we have a very strong and well-to-do tax base, and we have a history of almost perfect tax collections. I mean, we collect more than 99% of taxes billed. When they set these, percentages as a target or a best practice, they're taking into account the many towns where they're only collecting 85 or 80% of the taxes that are billed. So I don't think it would actually hurt our rating. That's my 2 cents. I won't stand on my soapbox for too long, but I would propose 14 to 16% as opposed to 15 to 17.
Okay. Kevin, you had your hand up.
Yep, I'm comfortable with the 15 to 17% range. I think as the uncertainty around the state finances continued to grow over the past few years, I think having that additional reserve will help smooth out the taxes going forward.
Derek, next.
Yeah, just piggybacking on what Kevin said, I'm comfortable with the 15 to 17. We have to pass our budget before we know what the state will even allocate to us for state funds. So until that changes, I'd rather err on the side of caution. We do have the ability to go below the 15 for unanticipated budgetary shortfalls. I'm not claiming that the town knows how to spend people's money better than themselves, but I feel as though 15 to 17 is appropriate.
Lisa?
First of all, I do appreciate the comments that Linda made, and I think that they're reasonable and authentic, and many people may agree with you. I do support the 15 to 17% range, given the uncertainty that we're in right now. This is what our rating agencies are recommending. And at this point, we don't have to tax to get to the 15 to 17%. We're already there, so it's not an additional tax burden, although that money could be spent this year they would be one-time expenses and wouldn't reduce the operating budget. They would be used at capital if we decided to go down to a 14%. But I'm comfortable at 15 to 17, given the uncertainty, especially with the global pandemic.
And Arthur?
Linda makes very valid points. All the reasons I'm for 15 to 17 have already been said, so I won't reiterate them, but I think that's perhaps where we should be.
As expected. Just
fair enough.
That there was a move afoot in the state government that when they saw how much towns had in their rainy day funds, they wanted to rate it. So if you have too much money in there, be careful. But I knew I would lose this vote, so that's fine. I just wanted to make the case for not overtaxing.
I appreciate that very much. So just for the record, I'm probably slightly more in Linda's camp than everyone else's, because I have the same feeling. And I think we've done an extremely good job, not as a Board of Finance, but as a town, in overall managing our expenses and our revenues and balancing a budget and collecting as well as we do. I think if we consistently outperform that range, then we maybe should look back and adjust, where we set the mill rate going forward and all the things we do doing that, because I am completely in Linda's camp that we shouldn't tax people today because we might need to tax them tomorrow. If we can consistently cover our expenses and balance the budget and maintain our good rating, that's what we should do. But in an effort to get this policy on the books and with the noted, I think that Derek said that we have the ability to adjust downward if we need to, or upward if we also need to. And the time, I think the 3 years is a good edit that we needed to make so that to get back in compliance with what we want. So I would recommend it and support the 15 to 17. So what I would need then would be a motion for that, having already made the changes on the 3 other items.
I'll move that we adopt the policy with Linda's 3 changes as written.
Second.
15 to 70%.
Yeah. Seconded by Derek. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, 1 against. You got that, Karen? Okay, great. All right, good. Next item then is the proposed general fund and capital transfers. And this one, Amy, you can tee up. So.
Yeah. So this one I will take care of. The financial results, so hold on, let me just get my pages. Okay, so just for a little bit of context, since we're not going to go through the year-end financial results first, the way that we ended the current fiscal year in fiscal year 20 is we had excess revenues of about 1.4 million, and then we had expenditure savings of about 1.5 million. So there is about almost $3 million that would be added to fund balance before any transfer requests. So as you can see at the bottom over here, the unassigned fund balance at this $3 million contribution is 19%. So if we go over to the general fund transfers, so these are the transfers that we're requesting to come out of the general fund. The first one is a contribution to the Simsbury Farms Fund of $15,000 to make them whole. They did have a small loss this year to the tune of $15,629. So we are requesting that we make that fund whole and zero out that loss.
Amy, quick question there. Earlier in the end of year, it looked like the loss was 8,000. Did that change?
Yeah.
No, so the loss is 8,000, but they have golf surcharge money that they're allowed to keep in the fund and designate for golf use. So if we trued up the golf surcharge fees that they took in, the expenditures that were offset against the golf surcharge, and then we actually, I can just show you. Well, I probably have to reshare, huh? Okay. So if you look at the Simsbury Farms Fund here, you'll see the $8,000 loss that you were mentioning. And then there was a $53,000 balance at the end of last year that was designated for golf. So then the unassigned was zero because we transferred to make them whole. last year as well. So the 53,000, and then if you add in your golf surcharge revenue, and then there were some expenditures during the year of about 58,000 that went against that golf surcharge revenue. The new designated balance for golf is about $60,000, which brings the fund loss to $15,000.
Can you remind me what the designated balance for golf is and explain to me what that is?
This is before my time. Tom Tversky might be able to provide more insight on that. I think I saw him on here. I don't know when it came about, but I think that they created this golf surcharge some years past to be able to be used for golf equipment. And they're allowed to keep that money as designated for golf use during the year.
I thought that was only if they raise the revenue.
I think the golf surcharge is them raising the revenue.
Yeah, they do through the surcharge, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So why is there a deficit?
There's not. The deficit is for the rest of the fund. The designated golf piece is $60,000 to the good.
Okay, I'm missing the explanation of the 8 to 15.
So we have an $8,000 designation. So we started with a fund balance of $53,000. That was all golf related. And then you subtract out your $8,000, we come up with $45,000. If we take last year's golf and we take the designated balance from last year, we add in the $65,000 that they collected. We take out, there was $58,000 in expenditures and equipment related to the surcharge funds. We get to $60,000, and then the negative $15,000 equals your fund balance of $45,000. So it's just reallocating what this fund balance is.
Are we subsidizing a shortfall in the designated for golf? I mean, what did they take in more money in surcharges than they spent out?
Yes, we typically do.
Right.
That fund was started in about, I think in 2015, maybe 2016 it started. So it was before I got here, but annually it carries over. And we only take out, what we can afford. We've also taken in, split some of that maintenance equipment with our friends at the Friends of Simsbury Farms and the Simsbury Farms Men's Club as well, on shared equipment. But it typically goes toward equipment or new purchases, such as computers for the point of sale system at the golf course, that kind of thing.
Tom, why is it being subsidized by the general fund? Then?
It's not being, there's no subsidy. If I'll work it out with Amy, but there's been no subsidy. That account has not been run dry or overspent.
Okay, so it's just an accounting adjustment, Amy? Is that it?
There was two donations last year. I'm sorry, Amy, if I didn't mean to speak over you.
Okay.
There was two donations last year from the Men's Club and the Friends of Simsbury Farms for the greens roller. Those were $4,400 each. I do not know if those were applied. I think they were applied to a donation account and not back to the surcharge account.
No, that wasn't. So this is basically like the fund balance related to the golf surcharge over the years. So they've collected $60,000 in net revenues over the years from collecting this surcharge related to golf. So this fund balance has to be at least $60,000 because they've collected $60,000. The rest of the fund outside of the surcharge has lost $15,000. So if you net the two, you get your fund balance of $45,000.
Oh, so it's just the opposite. The excess of the surcharge versus the money that came out of the surcharge fund was an additional $7,500, and we've got to put that money back into the surcharge fund.
Right,
Lisa,
exactly.
you get that? So it's the opposite of the general fund subsidizing it. We're replenishing the fund that was actually augmented by taking in more for the surcharge than they spent out.
Right. So maybe that's like a better way to explain it. Basically, the surcharge that they're able to keep is subsidizing the rest of the fund until you put it back.
If you took out the money that came into the surcharge or the surcharge fund and the expenses that came out of it, we would have lost $15,000.
Exactly.
The fund would have gone down $15,000, and that's why the general fund has to put that money in. We lost $15,600.
I think we can move on.
Yeah, I do too.
I mean, I guess my only question would be is, should we be netting out any expenses that aren't related to golf?
What do you mean?
Well, can you go back? I can't see it anymore.
Oh.
But like restaurant, there were other items that weren't related to golf. I don't know if that applies.
Yeah,
Those are those are part of the $15,000 loss.
right.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Yeah. This is an accounting.
Okay.
We lost $15,600. We're replenishing it with a general fund transfer.
Right.
Yeah, keep going.
Yep. So the next item down is a requested transfer into the capital projects fund for the Hot Brook Landing irrigation. This came about from a previous Board of Finance meeting where Board of Finance members had received some feedback from residents that they were upset about the dying grass due to the warm conditions that we had, and they would like to see an irrigation system. So we did include that if the Board of Finance so chooses. Two other capital projects, we had the ice rink condenser project and the rink control panel. Those were already previous appropriations for approved capital projects. However, when Todd Taberski went out to bid for these projects, the bids came in higher than anticipated, than budgeted. And so in order to complete those projects, we need an additional $60,000 to complete.
Amy, just on those, Tom, I know it's hard. You're not an engineer when you do those estimates, but could we get a summary of how we are estimating, and is there a standard that we're using? Because we are consistently coming in under budget in Culture Parks and Recs programming, and we're coming in over budget in some of our others when we go and look at the capital. So maybe it's time to sort of look at our process and procedure as to how we're doing our estimates, and is there a way to get those a little bit tighter? There may not be, but I'm asking that question.
Yeah, I mean, we use the vendors who bid on the project, but it was estimated in some cases 18 months to 2 years ago. The market has changed. We didn't account for a consulting fee with the rink condenser. Otherwise, that would have been just about a break even from where we originally estimated it. That was close. But other projects we've done, like the Simsbury Meadows fencing project, we had a budget of $100,000 for that, and we came in at 66. I mean, we do the best we can. And I'm sorry.
I meant as a criticism. I'm sorry, Tom. It was just to try and get to a truer number.
We don't turn in a number that we don't believe is the right number. I wouldn't turn in a number that I didn't believe is the right number. I mean, certainly we can look at the process we've used and learn from it going forward. Is certainly, I think Sean mentioned last night, doing an escalator if a number is more than a year or two old. So those are things we can look at. And I'm still fairly new at this, so I will certainly fall on the sword. It's my number, and I'll take that and that criticism and learn from it going forward.
Yeah, no, mine was more general as to all capital. How are we doing our estimates, and what's our process and procedure?
And can I jump in for a second on not those two items, but on the irrigation system? Mm-hmm. First off, say thank you. I'm heartedly in support of that. But as a sort of general comment, it concerns me that we're now discovering that we have $2.something million in surplus because we managed so tightly. And as an example of that, at Hot Brook Landing, a bunch of the bushes that got planted at some expense, and bushes are not cheap, are now dead. So now we're putting in irrigation system, but we've lost thousands of dollars worth of bushes. So sometimes managing that tightly, when it actually was in the budget, we had that money. We had $2.something million more than we seemingly spent. So I'm just a little concerned that was a short-sighted thing to not put the irrigation system in. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, the next one down is the Public Works Utility Van, another transfer to the Capital Projects Fund. So if you recall, at the end of the last budget cycle, there were a couple capital projects that didn't make it into the final round of funding. we were able to identify that we were going to have some savings in the public works budget in this current fiscal year. And so we were going to save these items for the end of this fiscal year to be funded with those savings. So that was the utility truck in the amount of $46,000. The next one is another transfer to the capital projects fund for a public works truck. This is something that came up about a couple weeks ago. Tom Roy had requested the purchase of a new vehicle. I guess the vehicle that they have is in quite disrepair and it's not worth fixing. He told me if I wanted to add some sparkle to my presentation that he was in the truck today. I guess it must have been like the bed or something, and the weight of him almost went through the truck. So I will add that for Tom Roy to help make his case for him. So that is a $40,000 request for that maintenance truck. The Board of Education non-lapsing transfer, $266,000. When I go through the year-end results, you'll see that the Board of Education had savings of the $266,000 due to COVID. Although that they had some significant savings in fiscal year 20 due to COVID, and fiscal year 21 is kind of a different story, getting the schools back up and running with the technology needs, the distance learning, the requirements related to the state. So you'll see that as part of my finance director's report later on. So they are requesting to be able to keep those funds to use for potential deficits this year. A transfer request to the Capital Reserve Fund. When we did our issuance this year for bonding, we did get a bond premium in the amount of $1,021,941. Just as in past practice, we like to put that in the reserve fund and offset our debt service costs going forward. And then the last item is a capital reserve transfer for either potential future capital or future budgets. So this $2.4 million was generated from the fund balance. So it's actually going to play into the policy that you adopted tonight. So if we transfer out the $2.4 million into the capital reserve fund, our unassigned fund balance will be at that minimum 15% that you all just adopted. So if there is another number that you would like to use to keep an unassigned fund balance, the 16%, 17%, we can make adjustments to this number.
Amy, I have a question. I had called you earlier and I don't know if you have that information, but if we transfer the 2.5 million into the capital reserve fund, to do a mid-year transfer requires two boards approval, the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance, as is typical with all our transfers. But during the budget process, sometimes as we do the appropriating and then send it to referendum, we will do an appropriation from the general fund. The Board of Finance has always had the authority to do that as part of its budget making and appropriation authority. If we transfer that out and decide we want to do a different allocation during the budget process, not a mid-year, do we need the Board of Selectmen's approval to do that transfer? So that would be an additional step rather than what we normally do during the budget process. And I don't know if you've had a chance to get that number.
So I did talk to Bob earlier today. He doesn't have a solid answer, but I did express, and he did agree that, you know, the Board of Finance is the one to determine how things are funded or to figure out how to pay for things. So I'm pretty sure that that's where we're going to land, but he could not confirm for this evening. So we do have a scheduled call with him later on in the week where he'll be able to provide that answer.
Okay. And then the second point I wanted to make is that just if we decide to do that transfer, I just want to be very clear and for the record, it doesn't mean we're going to spend it on capital. That's a different way to hold it as reserve. We have other outstanding costs coming up, like the pension and the mortality that we may want to use for mill rate stabilization or to pre-fund some of the pension. So it's a way, it's just an alternate reserve. And to Linda's point, to pull it out of the general fund in case the state is looking. So it's not being necessarily deceptive, but putting it in a designated fund. So I guess I would say until we get the answer from Bob D definitively, I would forego that transfer and do that at the next meeting once we have the definitive answer. And I would be inclined to do it at 16%, but I'm open to discussion there and not adamant.
Okay. The other points I was going to mention, Lisa just did, so I will move on. Transfers into the general fund, assigned fund balance. So these are items that they are going to stay within the general fund. They are going to go into the general fund balance, but we would like to assign them. So we had some significant salary savings this year. And part of the reason that we had that savings is because we have several unsettled union contracts, that are still in negotiations. So when these contracts are finally negotiated, there are step increases and general wage increase that should have been paid out this year had the contracts been settled that will need to be paid out in fiscal year 21. So we are requesting that $182,000 be transferred to assigned to be used for that purpose. We had a couple of smaller items. This one was one that didn't make it into the budget. Our human resources coordinator would like to take a human resources certification course. It's about $1,300. And then our assessor is requesting some intern help to get some of their data entry up to date. Currently, right now, they have their the planning department software and the assessor software. And Francine likes to use her staff for the bigger picture things and try to kind of stay away from, having her staff do all of the data entry. So this will correct itself in the coming months. Planning is getting a new software, and the software will actually talk to the assessor software. So they're just hoping to get some additional hours from somebody to kind of help with that data entry until this process is up and running. So that's that request. So I don't know if you want me to move on to the capital transfers and we can kind of just do all the transfers at once.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. All right, moving on to the capital transfers. We have a transfer going to the sewer use fund so that there was a capital project that's being closed out for the WPCA for an H2O rehab system that had a very small savings of $900. So the original funding source was the sewer use fund. So we're going to put the money back into the sewer use fund. The transfers between capital funds. This is another thing that happened during the budget process where there was a couple capital items that didn't make it into our priority list. And since we knew that we were going to have savings this year, we were going to wait until the end of the fiscal year to fund those. So the savings that we had came from the PAC fencing project of about $33,000. And so we want to fund the $25,000 in playscapes and then the $8,000 in some rink fencing.
I have a question about the fencing. Is that earlier in the packet, it says that the project is to be complete in October and that at this point there's $100,000 left in there. So what's the difference between the $33,000 here and the $100,000 elsewhere in this packet?
So the $100,000, the funds actually haven't been spent yet, but we have the bids in hand, so we know what the project is going to cost us.
So there is still accounts payable that we haven't been billed for yet. Okay.
Correct. Yep. Moving on to transfers to the capital reserve. So the general fund transfer, that's what we just talked about, the transfer, getting the fund balance down in the general fund. The general fund bond premium, so like in past years, we'll transfer that to the capital reserve to offset the future debt. The Eno Hall Memorial Special Revenue Fund, this is something that the Board of Finance had us look at during when they had me review all of the special revenue funds. This was one of the funds that they wanted to close, so they requested we find a purpose for this money and try to close out the fund. So there are, with this special revenue fund, this money has to be used on the Eno building. So we are proposing, there is some work that needs to be done around the entrance and the ADA compliance and the parking lots, that we were going to use some trust funds that we've been trying to build up over time to complete this project. But if you all are fine with closing this fund, we would like to use these funds in order to make those entrance improvements and ADA compliance improvements, since it has to be within that building. And then we'll still use the trust for any remaining balance that's left on the project.
So Amy, do we also then need to make an appropriation in additional to a transfer?
Well, you're not approving the project yet.
Oh, okay.
That'll be during budget, but this will just earmark the money to be used for that project in the future. The capital, transfer to capital fund, these next three are just small savings related to some capital projects that are closed out. So the turf fields had about $4,800 in savings. The portable generators had about $250 savings. And then we had some very minor savings related to some equipment for about $40. So that brings us down to where we are in our capital reserve summary, which is not entirely accurate because we are going to hold off on this transfer. So then it brings our assigned fund balance in the capital reserve related to the bond premium and the Eno Memorial Hall funds, along with our previous bond premium that we put in here. And then it gives us an unassigned capital balance for $5,100 to be used for future budget years until you all make the transfer at your next meeting, if you all decide to do so.
Amy,
So
go ahead, Linda.
Go ahead and finish and I'll ask a question.
So one of the questions that came up in talking with Sean Askham, I don't know if you're on, Sean, but Sean was concerned about how, while we do designate like bond premium and this has to be Eno, how can the public see that? And is there a way that you can either do it with fiscal notes or show this in an accounting manner so that the public can see that it's been sort of earmarked for a specific purpose?
Yeah, sure. So I can include that in my my quarterly reports. Like I typically do something. There is something that says capital reserve or reserve on one of the capital project schedules, but I can create a new schedule since we're going to have something in those reserves potentially that will be more than the bond premium. So I can do a schedule that breaks out where we're at and what's included in those dollars.
Perfect. So that may help the different boards keep track of what the original purpose for the transfers were. Thank
you.
Yep. So I have a question. So I am a little troubled that we're almost, had an extra $2.9 million, almost $3 million at the end of the year, and we're now transferring it around. But at the time we passed the budget this year, we didn't. I mean, it was like, oh my God, we're going to die. We don't have enough money. And so we didn't end up funding a position for Parks and Rec. And I'm wondering what people might think about using some of this surplus, because I truly do believe, and Tom did not pay me to say this, but I do believe they need another position. And we didn't fund that position. And now we have this surplus. And I'm throwing that out there, I know, kind of on a wing and a prayer, but is there a way to do that, and is that something that the Board of Selectmen would want to consider and come back and suggest?
So, Linda, while I certainly appreciate the need for this, I'm not sure I would use reserves or a closeout for an operating expense, because that's an ongoing expense as opposed to a capital, but I'd certainly consider it in the next operating budget when it's presented to us in the spring. I'm hesitant to do things that should have been budgeted for and weren't, and this will be an ongoing operating expense. It's not a one-time expense, so I could not support that at this time, but I would certainly consider it during the budget process.
I would concur with that. If when we get halfway through this fiscal year and we're continuing to be at that pace, then I would say we wouldn't necessarily have to make. I would be equally open, Linda, to a request for an appropriation for a position that would be part of the upcoming budget too, because it was in and we took it out, that kind of thing. But I don't think we should do it out of the excess that we garnered from. I'm with Lisa on the use of those one-time funds. So if we continue to operate at that kind of positive margin, then we should be willing to look at the positions we didn't allow last year, mid-year, on an as-needed or emergency basis, whatever. All right?
Yeah.
That'd be my position anyway. All right. Amy, so with all of this, so what do we, I'm a little, you took out the general fund reserve for 2,450,000. So we decided to leave that out. So you are asking that we make this $5,000 unassigned and $2 million of designated assigned capital transfers tonight.
Right, so yes, for the capital, and then the general fund would be these transfers, 1.4 million and then $188,000.
All right. So I would need a motion to that effect.
So moved, and a question?
Yes.
What are our reserves at with these transfers?
So the non-spendable, which is basically your prepaid expenditures, is 104,000. Your unassigned, your assigned, I'm sorry, is your encumbrances, and then your unassigned is about 17 million, which is about 17.5%.
Okay, so I do want to say I am open to doing, even if it requires two boards, to doing some transfer in the future. I just want to get clarity on what the authorizations are.
Understood.
So wait a minute, even with all of these transfers, we're at 17.5%?
Yes.
Above the range.
During
It's above the range.
Yeah, I think during the budget cycle, weren't we at like 16 or something like that? Like we were already pretty high.
So I'll second the motion then.
All right. Any further discussion on this? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Derek, you're muted. You're in.
Yeah, I said aye.
Okay. I can't see Art. So, Amy, can you stop sharing your?
I was aye.
Okay. All right. So we're unanimous then. Karen, did you get that? Okay. There were no votes. All right. All right. Moving on. The proposed police private duty fund transfers.
All right, so this one I'll just put up the agenda submission item just so I can go through. All right, so at your last Board of Finance meeting, we let you know that the state was implementing a bill that they had passed where in fiscal year 22, there was going to be the requirement to use body cameras and dash cameras for all police officers in their vehicles that are engaging with the public. They're going to make available a funding source via OPM for a 50% reimbursement for the distressed municipalities and then a 30% reimbursement for all others. One of our sergeants had done some work and talked to somebody at the state, and they actually have a current program going on where we can make the purchase of the body cameras and get a 50% reimbursement. Those funds are on a first come, first served basis. So we would like to push up the purchase of the body cameras and the dash cameras so that we can take advantage of that 50% reimbursement. This is something that's already gone through the Board of Selectmen for approval, and they did make the recommendation to approve. The other items included in here is 3 admin vehicles for the police department. So typically they had been using their police vehicle fund over the years to fund any new admin vehicles. When we reviewed the special revenue funds, there was a request to close out that fund and have it just be included as part of the capital plan. So since they had to wait for the buildup of the funds to get the admin vehicles, they're actually behind on some of their vehicles that need replacement. So they would like to use some of the private duty money to get caught up on their vehicles. And now after these 3, they'll be on a consistent replacement cycle going forward and part of the overall capital plan. Just back to the cameras for a moment. The purchase of everything is about $114,000 for the total, the body cameras, the dash cameras. And then there's also going to be anticipated ongoing costs of about $46,000 a year for the licensing, the maintenance, and the storage. So in future budget years, we can obviously look for methods to pay that, but the police private duty fund at present does make enough money to cover those ongoing maintenance costs. Wanted to add that as well. So here you have your financial impact. It shows that the private duty fund ended the current fiscal year at about $400,000. The cost of the 3 admin vehicles at $138,000. The initial cost of the body cameras and the car cameras are about $114,000. And then this leaves a balance in the police private duty fund of about $150,000. Initially, we had requested that this money be transferred into the capital reserve for future use by the police to be on an assigned basis. But given the discussion that we have to have with the town attorney about transferring into the capital reserve, I'm assuming that you will want to hold off on this transfer as well. But feel free to ask questions. The chief is here if you have any questions for him.
I have a question.
Amy, it's a little different discussion on this one. This one, we talked about closing this fund or actually following the strictures or the restrictions on the fund, which say at the end of the year, any excess goes into the capital reserve fund to be designated. So this is just actually doing what the fund requires us to do. So slightly different. Now the question is, does this, I guess the question to council is, does the transfer require both boards to approve it, to put it back in the general fund, if the nature of the fund that was created requires it to go back to the general fund? Or is that not, is that what we're waiting on from council?
Yeah, so Bob's going to get back to us on that one as well. He didn't have a clear answer.
Question.
Yeah, Derek.
Yeah, I'm just curious, admin vehicles to me kind of implies low use, low miles. Can you just give me an idea of what kind of vehicles these are at 46 plus-ish dollars per vehicle, and whether there's any special build out or whether there's any special use? It just seems a tick high for me per vehicle for what I would think is, as an admin vehicle, like I said, low use, low miles.
It's hard to get a Maserati for less than $46,000.
So, Derek, these vehicles are Ford Explorers.
Okay.
So they are kind of basic model Ford Explorers. We do go off the state contract price for those. Okay. So it is significantly less. And then we also get anything else that we need on that is 20% off of by way of the state bid as well. Where the price starts to jump up is in outfitting that car with the things that we need in it, which are not things that are in a normal car. So you have a transfer of emergency lights, you have a transfer of some of the emergency equipment like a police radio that's in those cars. And that roughly is, several $1,000s for each car. Okay. So that's where the cost is. When you get rid of a car, you have to strip some of those things. Some of those things are reusable, like a police radio. Mm-hmm. But what that boils down to is hours. And sometimes it's taking apart a lot of that car, the middle console, the dash. And so there's 50, 60, 70 hours into changing some of these cars out. And that's where it becomes expensive.
Yeah, so it's just not for simply driving around town. There's significant fit out for these admin vehicles. That totally makes sense.
They are, yes.
Can we go back to being able to see everybody? And yeah. I'd like to propose that we break this into different parts. I mean, I think it's a layup that, of course, we should spend this money on the body-worn cameras. They're required, and it makes sense to do that right away. So I'd like to move that we agree to spend part of this fund on the body-worn cameras and then take the other 2 items separately. Does nobody else think we should do the body-worn cameras?
Well, hang on. We have two items, the admin vehicle and the body and car cameras.
Right,
Are
I'm
you
just like-
separating
Yeah, do one at a time.
the body and cars? You want to separate those apart?
I'm okay with doing the bodies and the cars together, the cameras and the cars together.
Okay.
If you,
I'm fine doing this in two pieces if we think that'll accomplish what we do. So we have a motion to separate these into two, to vote on the dash cameras and body cameras as a separate item, right? Is that what you're asking, Linda?
yeah, I'm okay with, I mean, you can put it as three things or as two things. I'm okay.
Well, but in the memo, the cars and the bodies are added into a single cost of $114,000.
Yeah, okay, so let's do
Yeah.
that.
Okay. So I need a second to that motion to vote on these.
I'll second.
Seconded by Art. Any discussion on this expenditure from this fund? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? No. All right. So then the second part of this is to use this fund to purchase 3 admin vehicles for $138,000.
So move.
Do I have a second?
Second?
Seconded by Lisa. All right. Discussion. Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Approved. So the last thing we're doing then is what the fund requires, which is to transfer the balance to the general fund. And that doesn't really need a motion, right? Or does it, Amy?
So it would be to transfer it to the CNR fund, but we're going to hold off until we get guidance from Bob.
Okay.
Whether it's one board or both boards. So that'll be on your next agenda.
Okay.
But I thought that the existing policy, as I looked back at what was presented, that this fund has been inappropriately used for a long time, but that because you discovered the policy required that the excess be put back in the general fund.
So when we had the discussion on the special revenue funds, yes, that is what we found. And then we made a proposal that it did not go back into the general fund because we already have a significant fund balance in the general fund, and that those funds go into the CNR fund to be earmarked for police use. And, if at some point you wanted to use it for other things, that was the prerogative of, I believe you wanted to leave it to the Board of Selectmen to make their priority list. So that's kind of where we left it. So right now the recommendation or the proposal was to move it into that CNR fund, but Lisa just wanted to get some clarification from the town attorney as to whether we need one board to approve it or both boards to approve it, because last night the Board of Selectmen did not approve that transfer.
Okay, can you tell us why they didn't approve it?
Sure. So they're here to elaborate, but I'll give you the gist of it. Oh, sorry, Eric, if you want to take that.
No, that's okay. I think it was a relatively lengthy discussion, but the crux of it, I think the concern was that if the transfer were to occur, those funds could be used for anything in any department as opposed to for police use.
That Eric, I would just add that can be done now, depending on your priorities, even if it's in the fund. And you can, I talked with Sean, if you can put it in the capital reserve fund and you could designate it, you're going to prioritize it during your process with everything else. And if it's your top priority, it's going to be used for cars. So from my perspective, it's more just an accounting maneuver and not a substantive maneuver in any way, because it doesn't change your authority or our authority or your ability to prioritize or your ability to say, hey, this is our top priority, we want to reserve it for the police. But it also gives you the flexibility, which you have now with any capital reserve, to recommend that you fund something else if there's a huge crisis that requires all hands on deck. So I don't see it as a substantive change or really a change in who gets to decide how to spend it or whether we're going to buy the cars. We're buying the cars. and so that's how I view it. But I'm happy to get clarification from council on that as well.
Yeah, and my concern on it was, maybe it was just the way that it was written. Thank you, Mark. That it, again, my preference is that this be allowed every year, that money would be part of whatever money the Board of Selectmen looks at, and that you weigh, do the police need it more? Does the senior center need it more? Does the social services need it more? I don't want to assign all of this future money to be always used for the police any more than, the building department takes in revenue every year. It's not assigned to be used for just the building department. The town clerk takes in money every year. It's not assigned solely for their use. I mean, I don't see why any one department gets to keep its own revenue, whether that's within a fund or within the general fund or the capital reserve fund. I don't think it should be assigned to a particular department. I think that should be the Board of Selectmen who on an annual basis decides what's the top priority and how are we going to spend all of our money. And I don't think this year's board should tie the hands of a future board by saying, well, this money is earmarked always for one particular department. That's what my concern is. I'm not even so concerned whether it goes into the capital reserve fund or the general fund. I just want to make sure that there isn't a predestined decision that ties people's hands in perpetuity in the future. That was our very clear instruction last time we met.
So just a clarification, no matter if you assign it or unassign it, even if you assign it, you still have the authority to unassign it at any point in time. It doesn't tie anybody's hands.
Legally, yes, a perception issue. That,
Yeah.
hey, this was always.
So I think I sort of will, I understand and agree with you, Linda, that I believe what you have just described was the intent of what our discussion was. I think we've made good progress because prior to this, what we're proposing tonight, the cars would be bought and then they would have had the excess budget. We're agreeing to allow these cars to be bought as a capital item, but in the future, these funds will then just go right into the general fund or the capital reserve fund, and it will, as always, be the recommendation of the Board of Selectmen with the approval of the Board of Finance to get to decide how we should spend all of the dollars. So it seems like we've made progress. I don't know if we're following exactly the letter. The words assigned to the police department is the part that's different than what we had said the other night. Is that agreed?
Yes, let's just not assign it to anything.
Yeah.
Rob, if I could on that, it goes both ways. I mean, you also don't want police department expenditures to be seen to be dependent on it. I mean, if you follow Linda's logic, what you could easily say is, police department really doesn't have enough money for an essential item this year, so let's just note that. And next year, take it out of the private duty fund because that's the source of revenue. I mean, I think in both directions, it's not good policy.
Exactly. Good point, Art. If what we were doing was trying to find money to buy the cars and we had to take it out of the general fund, then it should be just as healthy a conversation for that flexibility. If that's a priority.
If we see this as basically police funds, the argument can be made, then fine. Wait a couple of years and take it out of your private duty fund once you got the money. Don't do it now. It's just not, it's not a good solid way to figure out what they need and when they need it.
It's exactly what the conclusion we came to when we talked about this before. So the action there's no additional action to take tonight, I think. We need the clarity just on Lisa's question but going forward, I'm not sure there's anything else we actually have to do. We do have to transfer this at some point, right?
Right, so the transfer from the private duty fund will be on your next agenda as well
Okay.
as
Well, along with the
the fund balance.
surplus. Yeah, okay. Everybody okay with that? All right. All right, great. Thank you all for that, and appreciate the Board of Selectmen being here in support of this discussion. So now we can move to the presentation on the Meadowood property. And appreciate everyone being flexible to wait for us to get to that point. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Honor Lawler here from the Trust for Public Land. Thanks for having me. And again, I think that Tom Fitzgerald was going to help me run the slideshow tonight.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. So I'm going to present the project. It's been presented to a number of the land use commissions, the Board of Selectmen, and I tailored it a little bit just to, I think, answer some of the questions that you folks might have as we, sort of sort this out in the municipal process. So next slide. So a little bit of background about the Trust for Public Land. We are a nonprofit conservation organization. Our mission is to protect land and create parks, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. We were founded in 1972, and our headquarters are based in San Francisco. We have a presence in roughly 40 states or so. We've been active in Connecticut since the 80s. I work out of our New Haven office, currently out of my home office until things get sorted out on that front. And in Connecticut, we've protected about 95 properties or 8,000 acres across the state. Probably this number might be a little bit outdated, but $150 million in fair market value. We've worked with Simsbury in the past on the Ethel Walker Woods project, which many of you or some of you might be familiar with. We also protected a number of properties behind the Simsbury Performing Arts Center. They were owned by, this is a little bit before my time, but the Gerard, Vincent, and Baker properties. And so those form the open space behind the performing arts that sort of skirt the Farmington River there. Next slide. So here today to talk about the Meadowood project. This is the background, the project history. In the past, Mike Glidden has sort of presented this slide, but it's pretty self-explanatory. The project was approved under the 830G statute in 2008. It calls for 296 homes, a portion of which are affordable. Those approvals are valid until 2022, at which point Griffin would either apply for new approvals or let those expire. And part of this original property was already conveyed to the town, the triangle piece, and then that strip that goes along Barn Door Hills Road. And this has been sort of actively marketed, since its approvals. Next slide. And I should say, at any point, if anybody has questions and wants to jump in, just interrupt me. So some of the interesting features about the Meadowood property, it has a historic connection to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's where one of the farms where he worked and lived during his 2 summers in Connecticut. There's an opportunity to create a number of trails through the property and connecting to adjacent property to create a cohesive trail network between McLean Game Refuge and Masako State Forest Great Pond. There's an area that is planned for future needs for athletic fields, and we are working with the State Historic Preservation Office to preserve the historic barns to the extent that's possible along Firetown Road and potentially Hoskins Road. And next slide. So as I sort of talked about the attributes. This is sort of how we've broken down the property, and this is still tentative, but 140 acres would be sort of protected open space with trails. It would have a recreational access easement that's held by the state of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. 24 acres or so for athletic fields, parking, 117 acres for to be maintained as agricultural land and working farmland. And then 3 acres with the historic barns and interpretive displays would sort of serve as a historic cultural site for the community and for the state. Next slide. So this shows the breakdown of the property with the open space and trails components on the south side of Firetown Road and the north side of Firetown Road. And then the working farmland piece on County Road and Hoskins Road, the athletic fields on Hoskins Road. Let you guys take a look at that for a minute before I switch.
So I have a little problem seeing color, and I know you've got the trails and the farm trail. Can you just sort of talk about the trails and what they are so that I can understand them, the difference?
Sure. Yeah, that's apologies on the color. So those are, most of those dotted lines are existing farm roads that would sort of be repurposed potentially as trails. Usually when we go into a project like this, if there are or aren't trails, we usually try and work with the community to see what their desires are. And, you know, sometimes it's making more trails, sometimes it's closing down areas that have been historically used as trails. But these are just, it's just a sketch and just a preliminary sort of drawing of what a trail system could look like on this property in the future.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And have you any estimates of what it would cost to build those trails?
So those are existing farm roads. So, you know, we haven't talked about costs of building trails yet. You know, that would be down the line if we saw that there was a need to create new trails. Generally, what we try and do when we work with communities is to work with volunteers on that front, as long as it's, you know, we have the wetlands mapped and, you know, we're very sensitive to the natural resource values. But oftentimes, if we're working, for example, on a state park project, the state would partner with us on the trail development. And in this case, you know, perhaps the Simsbury Land Trust or the town would take a look at that trail system.
Thank you.
Next slide. Next slide, Tom. Thanks. Oh, thanks. So this is a very preliminary capital funding model for the project. We have put it to Simsbury to potentially fund about a third of this acquisition. We have an existing open space application into the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. That's a conservative estimate, I think, of what we could potentially get. It's that being said, it's a very competitive program and it's a competitive year. So all of these numbers, you know, are subject to, you know, move around a little bit. But we hope that, you know, we've put penciled in conservative numbers here. 600,000 to the Highlands Conservation Act funding, which is funding that covers the Highlands region in Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And Simsbury is just on that very eastern edge of the Highlands region. And so it has a special congressional allocation to fund properties and land protection opportunities within that region. The state has applied for funding for this project, which is a really good sign into their interest into it. And they've secured $280,000 from the George Dudley Seymour Trust. That is a private fund that funds properties that they feel are worthy of their investment that the state has an interest in. And so the state applied for those funds and secured them. 1.475 from the Connecticut Department of Agriculture that would go towards the farmland preservation easement on the 117 acres of farmland. We have been awarded $800,000 from the State Historic Preservation Office, 500 of which is for capital, 300 of which is for barn stabilization and cultural/historic site development. And then there's the $150,000 sale of the lot on 129 Holcomb, which is an option that existed before the Trust for Public Land became involved in this project. And so that rounds out the capital and the purchase price that the Trust for Public Land has secured on this property. We have to cover our costs. And these kind of projects are very expensive. So we have a fundraising campaign to help us cover those costs. We fundraise, we ask individuals, foundations to help us fund our costs. And they often do so, our supporters do so because they believe in our mission and they like what we do. And that helps us, oops, sorry, a little bit of echo, offset some of the funds, and that the town might otherwise have to put forth. So we don't ask for the town to cover any of our costs. I just want to be clear about that. And then there are additional funds for land management. As Linda sort of touched on, we often try and raise a stewardship fund depending on our fundraising success. But so far we've raised $300,000 through that grant from the State Historic Preservation Office towards the stabilization/maintenance of the barns. And that would be utilized to hire a historical architectural historian, do the construction to stabilize those, and then the interpretive displays. And so that's sort of the, sorry, go ahead, Linda.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
Thank you for your presentation. We've been awaiting it for a long time, and I feel terrible that I have to even go to another meeting. So I'm going to cut to my most important question and then run out the door. I'm just concerned that I was sort of stunned when I read that the land would be estimated, if you were to change its use, at $223,000 in value. That's the revised estimate that you provided in the summary of the submission, and we'd be paying $6 million, or well, our share $2.2 million to acquire land that will become worth $200,000, $223,000, if it gets reclassified. That just sort of doesn't feel good.
No, I think that's, I don't think that's I think $223,000 is the property tax assessment should the land become reclassified under PA 490, in which case the tax revenue would drop very significantly. So that's not the property value.
No, it says if this were to happen, if it were reclassified, this is in the summary, you didn't write it, it was probably the staff. It says if this were to happen, the fiscal year 21-22 revised assessment is estimated at $223,000. This would result in decreased tax revenue to an estimated $8,500. So it just, why would we spend $6 million in total, plus almost $500,000 for your services, to buy a piece of property that, if it gets reclassified, is worth less than $250,000?
It's not worth less than $250,000. That's the tax assessment effect of it being reclassified.
Okay, that's not how it's written here. Perhaps that was a mistake on the staff's part. So if it were reclassified, what are you saying that the value of the land would be?
So that's a very hypothetical condition that I don't have the ability to answer that question, what the land would be worth if it were to be put into PA 490. Our appraisal is a present value appraisal of the property, and the fact that the landowner could at any moment, they could tomorrow apply to put it into PA 490, that's not going to necessarily drive the value significantly, because the value of the property is it has permits and approvals, it is shovel ready, and the highest and best use conclusion of the appraisal, doesn't take into account that hypothetical condition.
Okay, because what was clearly stated here, again, not your words, was that the land would only be worth $2.25, and the taxes would only be $8,000. So you're feeling differently about that. But I'm still concerned that it's a big price tag, and while you've assessed it, from what I understand from staff, that was a partial assessment, and you guys are somewhat oriented to open space preservation. We haven't had an independent assessment done, as far as I know, of the value of the land with just a land appraiser who doesn't have a vested interest in it.
So TPL hired an appraiser to do the appraisal. They don't, open space and conservation is not a highest and best use. And so for this property, they don't have a vested interest. They have ethical guidelines that they have to follow to make sure that the appraisal, they can stand behind it in a court of law, essentially. And so, yes, we did our own appraisal. We paid for it and we hired the appraiser. They don't sway their opinion of value based on who hires them.
Okay, thank you. And I apologize that I have to run to another meeting, but thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay, just a follow-up.
Yeah, I'd like to have, Maria has I think something she wants to share with the group, so I'd appreciate if she would chime in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. And I'm sorry for members of the Board of Finance if there was a little confusion around what is PA 490. I know that a few Board of Finance members were formerly on some of our land use agencies. So I think probably some members have a familiarity of what PA 490 is, what that means, how that potentially affects valuation. And it does significantly, if somebody applies for that PA 490 status and they successfully obtain that status, it does reduce the amount of taxes that they would own pretty substantially. We have, I believe, at this point in time, about 11 or so different properties in town that have PA 490 status. But if you would maybe just indulge us for just a moment, I think it might be helpful, perhaps if Mike could just elaborate a little bit about what that means. Is that okay, Rob, if we have Mike just explain
that?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Mike, would you mind explaining what PA 490 is?
Well, it's a reduction of your taxes based on the use of the property. So whether it's agriculture in the sense that you're growing something, silviculture, if it's forest preservation, it's just a way that an agricultural use has kind of a break to the normal taxes that the property would usually be subject to. It's encouraging agriculture in some form. Does that help?
So I guess I continue to be confused about what the property is worth today, empty with the approvals, what the property is worth today, empty without the approvals, and what our tax revenue is today based on empty with approvals, and what it would be based on empty without approvals or if we bought it.
Yes, so the Trust for Public Land did one appraisal to negotiate with the landowner in order to come to a purchase price agreement. That appraisal was a restricted report, and it was solely for TPL to negotiate that price. We also did an appraisal on 140 acres of that would be open space for the purpose of an open space grant application. Those appraisals, the appraisal of the open space, the 140 acres, has been shared with the town. Those should be kept in executive session. We, as Griffin has given us the opportunity to come up with a conservation outcome. The appraisal indicates a value, and we work to secure the money to come up with that value. What we can't do is share an appraisal for public consumption that would jeopardize Griffin's future ability to put that on the open market, to a developer, to, an individual, because they need to be able to market the property if our deal falls through. So once the property is acquired, or once the town bonds, depending on how your town leadership decides to do things, I imagine that appraisal could be, shared internally, but it is not a document that's meant for public consumption at this point.
One thing, we can go into executive session and you can share it with us in that if you feel better doing that. The second thing is we have a fiduciary duty to the town. So we have to independently verify that the property is worth what we think it is, whether that's done publicly or through executive session. I'm happy to support Griffin's, to the extent I'll rely on Maria to work with the FOIA Institute, how we could do that. But we have a fiduciary duty to ensure that this is a reasonable purchase. And the way we do that is generally when the town purchases a piece of land, they do an appraisal. We did that when we purchased Betty Hudson to make sure we weren't overpaying. So there has to be some way for the board who has to approve this to be able to meet our fiduciary duty there. And we can
we should do our own independent third party appraisal then. I mean, I would say that the discussion about Griffin not being able to market or having more difficulty marketing their land depends on exactly what the land will be used for. You talked about highest and best use. The land would be much more valuable if it was multifamily or single family home, zoned residential, as it would be, or if it was zoned industrial and you could put, a 200,000 square foot industrial building on there. The market will determine what the value is from an agricultural standpoint. I wouldn't know, but I think if the board in its true fiduciary capacity should do its own independent study.
Yes,
All right,
the town was listed as an intended user on the appraisal, and so I have shared that appraisal with the town's executive board of selectmen.
All right, so let's move on. Let's table that, and we'll decide whether we want to do executive session or see it or otherwise. Can we move on?
Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so switching gears a little bit from to sort of the economic benefits here that the town might realize from an open space acquisition of Meadowood. Conserved lands often provide more economic benefits that are a little bit harder to sort of pin numbers to, but that have absolute real value. Next slide. So in the next few slides, I'm going to just talk about how the Trust for Public Land works with our conservation economic staff to sort of actually do the research and look at the market data to put numbers to some of these sort of alternate benefits, if you will, to open space. Next slide. So conserved lands provide natural goods and services. We have done a number of return on investment studies across the country, and for every dollar invested in state land conservation programs returns about a $4 to $11 in natural goods and services. And I think the sort of most proximate state that we could sort of lean on is Massachusetts, where it came in at a 1 to 4 ratio. So some of the other natural goods and services that protecting the Meadowood property would provide, it sits on an aquifer protection zone. It has some known locations of threatened endangered species of special concern, and significant natural communities. Those are important to a lot of people and to our ecosystem and biodiversity in the resident area. Next slide. So conserving open space is good for public health. The average resident who uses parks for exercise saves $1,200 a year in healthcare costs. That's doubled for seniors. We often, when we do these analyses, we people expect the Trust for Public Land to say that, parks are good for you and, they're worth a lot of money. And so we are super conservative in our estimates, but, just calculating out, those dollars for Meadowood, so taking 1.5%, saying 1.5% of the people that use this property would gain that $1,200 a year in healthcare savings costs, attributes about $30,000 annually in cost savings for local residents. And then similarly for air and water quality, the healthcare costs associated with poor air quality, it provides a cost savings about $11,000 a year. And so that's using mapping that the Forest Service and independent research groups have worked on in testing air quality and vegetation and the reduction in the improvement in air quality from its proximity to green open space. Next slide. So enhancing property values, we know, and this has been extensively studied, that homes near conserved lands are worth more than elsewhere. And we take the lower bounds estimate of about 5% up to about 500 feet. And so if you think about Simsbury, the average home price, sale price being about $320,000 in Simsbury in this location, you have about 200 homes within 500 feet of the site. It adds about $16,000 per home. You're looking at a pretty significant increase in value in the resident community. Oftentimes other, I put here a University of Washington study just to show you, we really do use the conservative numbers. And so, in inner city areas where homes are located a quarter mile from a park, it increases their home value 10%. And then, to the sort of higher bounds, residential developments adjacent to green belts can increase as much as 32%. Next slide. So protecting this property has the opportunity to enhance recreational opportunities. I think during these sort of strange times, a lot of people have turned to nature. We know that spending time outside and in the outdoors, it makes people happier. Having this recreational amenity near nearly 1,300 people, that's within a half mile of the property. That's 385 kids, 225 seniors, and 58 low-income households that would have opportunity to access to new trails and open space. And then furthermore, additional multi-purpose athletic fields that would provide opportunities for local rec sports, which I think has been sort of something that they found in your town surveys about, the needs in parks and rec. And so similarly, we attribute a very conservative value of $6,400 a year in sort of cost savings. That's, people who visit this site that wouldn't have to drive further to a similar amenity or wouldn't have to, get in the car and spend money elsewhere. Next slide. Finally, farmland. So just pulling the average rental rate for Hartford County, it's about $98 an acre. That would generate roughly $11,000 in revenue were the town to lease it out at that average rate. And not to say that that's what you plan to do, but it's an opportunity. Nearly 100% of the farmland, the designated farmland area, is prime and statewide important farmland soils. Those soils are at a huge risk in our state. They're the most developable. And as climates change and sea levels rise, and the sort of breadbasket of Connecticut, the Connecticut River Valley, is inundated, people will turn to farmland within the interior of our state. And so it's really important to protect those areas now. And I really like this sort of warm and fuzzy thing from the American Farmland Trust. What seems abundant in the present may not be adequate in the future. Next slide. This is just a snapshot of Connecticut's outdoor recreation economy. It's $9 billion in consumer spending annually and $69,000 69,000 jobs. That's more than I think defense and aerospace combined. So it's big. Next slide. Okay, so these are just the sort of slew of resources I used. Our staff economist offered to answer any questions people might have if they're interested in digging deeper into sort of how we do that math and calculating public health and recreational values and things like that. That in here. Okay, questions?
I guess what percent, this is Kevin, what percentage of Simsbury is already deemed open space?
I would defer to someone else for that question.
Eric?
Sorry, I don't have the percentage, but I know it's 2,400 acres of open space.
My understanding was in a range of 30%. Does that sound accurate?
Tabarsky is saying yes.
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 Yeah, 30% is pretty close to the right number.
And then what percentage of the town is already single family homes? Residential single family homes.
By acreage.
What's that?
By acreage.
Correct.
Yeah. Nobody knows.
Okay. So the fair value market of the homes. Let's see, Honor, if I was using your number of 325, so if we had 325,000 times 296 homes, what would be the fair market value of the property?
So that is not exactly how they calculate the fair market value of the property. So just extrapolating the value of a home times the home value, there's a sort of cost absorption. So you're not going to build all those homes year one, right? It's going to take 30 years, depending on market demand, to build out those units. And so, you know, if you were to extrapolate the value and say, okay, you have $300,000 homes here, there's 300 of them, and they're all bringing in roughly $8,000 in taxes, you know, you might be able to come up with a number that's sort of a future number. So the math gets a little fuzzy there. Our appraisal does some of that. And so they have a discounted cash flow analysis that, you know, you can take a sort of deeper look at. But I wouldn't want to discuss that on here right now.
If I may, I think where you're going is right, Kevin, but I mean, you could simplify it down to just what is residential zone land worth. Okay. And so my question just simply is, what are we as a group, as a town, trying to protect against by conserving this land? The simple answer is just building 300 homes on it, right? So you have to look at the value of a developer of homes that looks at that land and says, oh, this is worth X per acre. I can build one home or two homes per acre, whatever the density is. And this is what the value of each acre is, already zoned multifamily. This isn't zoned multifamily. There's costs associated with rezoning it, but there's a pro forma and a budget that they will figure out what to charge for each home and what the costs are. But I think just the land itself, we would need to look at what is the value of the land if it's zoned residential for single family residential. And then we have to say, okay, is it $20,000, which is roughly, maybe it's a little bit more, $20,000 to $30,000, which is the 6 million on the entire, 288 acres? No, it's much higher than that. I would argue that it's upwards of 100,000, if not maybe a touch more, depending on where you are, and what kind of homes you're building and what density you're getting. But it's vastly more valuable as zoned residential. So it doesn't matter what the land is assessed at as agricultural. It's whether we think that you know, we're getting relatively good value, considering it's the opportunity cost is what it is. So I don't know if we can put it into, you know, an exact return on investment, it's more of a protected feature that to address what Honor was saying about the benefits of having open space. Okay, are those are kind of unquantifiable, but it's important to a lot of people. So the question is, is it worth $6 million? Is it worth $20,000 or $30,000 an acre?
So our appraisal supports our purchase price, and it is a bargain sale. And I would suggest, if until we have the benefit of that executive session, I would say, look to some comparable sales in the area. The Griffin sold the property just across the way. There's the solar property, and then there's the triangle piece that the town already bought. I think those are sort of good indicators of relative market value. Granted, markets change very quickly, but
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would say to that is I don't think, and I alluded to this earlier, that we'd be doing the town or would be acting as a fiduciary if we relied on a fee contractor's appraisal. We should do our own independent appraisal. I mean, you have a vested interest in getting this done, so we should have our own independent appraisal.
Yeah, and so the town was listed as an intended user of our appraisal on the 140-acre open space piece that we had appraised earlier a couple months ago.
Who paid for the appraisal?
The Trust for Public Land paid for it.
Okay.
Right. So an appraiser, when we do an appraisal, when we are involved in a project like this, we assume a lot of the risk and we assume a lot of the costs. And so paying for appraisals is one of those that we assume, but we do so in partnership with the town, with the municipality. There's the Trust for Public Land is looking for the best deal too. The more money we have to pay, the harder we have to work to get that money. And so we want a good deal just as much as you guys. And we want to pass those savings along that we can negotiate. And, for a bargain sale, we pass those along to the municipality. So it's,
Yeah, I appreciate that, Honor. I think as part of the presentation, it would be really helpful if you had land comps that were zoned multifamily or zoned residential. That would give the attendee or the reader the ability to kind of judge the 6 million versus what it could be if it were, zoned residential. I think it puts it in context.
So I'd like to sort of just redirect the conversation a little bit and realize I think it'd be beneficial to everybody if we talked about the timeline for this project and the decision making and how it fits in with overall town budgets and when our input and ultimately the voters' input will be come to the conclusion. So maybe somebody could speak to that. It's my understanding that right now we're contemplating that this would be the ultimate decision and referendum would be alongside the 2021-22 budgeting process. So we would be looking at it ultimately as a capital, along with all the other capital projects in the budget process in the spring. Is that correct? Am I right about that? Somebody, either Eric or Maria or Amy or.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the board had expressed Board of Finance had expressed a desire for us to do that. I know for TPL that time frame is a bit on the tight side, so we would probably have to, kind of keep working through that a bit. We did include this project with our debt modeling when we were preparing for the fiscal 2021 budget, and while it wasn't ultimately included, we did have the capacity for it. And over the last couple of years, we have been able to reduce a number of projects that were previously being captured in our debt modeling. So one was the public safety radio system project, and in partnership with the fire district, we were able to reduce that project from 2.5 to 1.2 million. So that was about 1.3 million in debt capacity that had come off, as well as the last 3 years, we were able to pay for a substantial amount of paving in cash, which also took an additional about $1.5 million out of that debt modeling. So we definitely have some capacity there, and we will include that again during budget development for you.
Yes, but I think that's exactly our point, which is that if you take this project on its own, absent the full budgeting process, and you say, would you rather have open space or not? The answer, for all the reasons Honor gave, would probably be yes. And then you augment that by saying, well, would you do that? Would you want open space if it costs you X per household on average? And the answer to that would probably be yes. But what we've been asking for and hoping for is that we can put all of these projects, not as they come along one at a time, but with all of the other things that we need to do, and say, this is our priority, and this project is included in there, and we can afford it. And we can afford it is what our job is as the Board of Finance, based on the recommendations of the Board of Selectmen. And so if you take it one at a time, we can afford every one of these projects. But if you take them all together, something's got to give. And that's what we're asking for. So, and I'd add one other aspect to this, which is what I thought Kevin Prell was going to, is that the opportunity cost is the potential of, if this land were developed, what the grand list increase would be and how that would impact our town. And that's a social discourse about development versus open space that I think would be very interesting to have between the voters in public hearing. And but in the context of, can we afford it with all of the other things we need to do? Because had this been, it was permitted, and had it been built, we would have a very different view of what we need to do for our long-range Board of Education plan. And we would also have a revenue source for it that may or may not make sense. I'm just saying that there's some big questions associated with this, that for those that purely want open space, it's a no-brainer. Could be, depending on what we think the land is really worth. I'll take Honor at her word that the appraisal says that we, in a vacuum, absolutely would buy it at this price versus what it's worth. But I think it would be hard for me as chairman of this committee to say that we should accelerate this to a separate referendum and go through that whole process in a vacuum without all of the other capital items. Now, that's me speaking as a chairman, but I would ask my other board members to chime in.
Yeah, Rob, I agree with you. I mean, that's what I was looking for, was really the opportunity cost lost by taking this piece of property out of the potential tax revenue. I know the town grows by about, the budget grows by about 2.5% to 3% a year. So looking down 10 years from now, where might we get some potential revenue sources from?
I agree also with Rob, your point, and Kevin, your point. It's just, and I just go back to Rob and I, when we did the economic, we recommended the town get a fiscal impact tool analysis so that we could do some of these analyses and look at opportunity costs, and also more intangible costs that Honor mentioned in terms of the benefit of open space. But there are actually ways to do this analysis, and there are programs that are out there, and sometimes that's only like $20,000 in expenditure. So I just think we have an opportunity and an obligation, and Honor, I'm sure your estimate is good, but I hope you can appreciate that we have a fiscal duty to independently verify that.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I'll.
Go ahead, Honor.
So I was just going to say, in terms of just to make a point, the tax revenue argument, that this would bring in future tax revenue to cover, future operating budget growth. Oftentimes, and 9 times out of 10, what we see in our studies across the country in all sorts of communities is that residential development does not cover itself in tax revenue. So for every dollar of tax revenue earned by, a single family home, the town is spending up to, $1.50 in costs of community services to, whether it's plowing or, busing the kid, paying to educate the kid alone is huge. And, I think there was some study that said this, development at this scale, it's about 1.6 kids per household or something like that. But I just make that point. And then to your point about the bundling this with other projects, I would just say that the longer that we wait to secure the funding, the riskier that this opportunity becomes. And so, we are on a timeline with the landowner. We have a contract. We have, considerations to make in terms of how we move forward with that. We put our resources, and like any organization, you spend and you spend, and at some point you sort of have to say, okay, is it coming to fruition, or do you cut your losses? And at this, if we don't have that anchor funding source of the town, I think this looks very speculative to our state agency partners who have been working alongside us to try and secure the funding for this piece. And so I would just say, waiting is a huge risk for us. We would advocate very strongly with leadership that this would be put forward sooner than May. With an extension, our contract only goes to July. So I'll leave it there.
Appreciate it. Understood. We've heard what you said. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Rob, if I could just add a note, I liked your comments. Honor, you did a very good presentation. And this is clearly something that's very attractive in the long term would be, but I think add great value to the town. There's a couple of factors here. One is that we are really fragile in terms of where this is going. Are we going to have an upsurge in coronavirus in the autumn and in the winter? The town is not in good shape for a revenue increase. There's unemployment, there's ALICE factors out there and all of that. So that this, while a long-term benefit, we're up into a very, very serious squeeze right now in terms of what our expenditures can be. And I come back to the point that both Lisa and Rob have made is compared to what? In other words, what is the town budget going to be? And of all the capital improvements we've got coming at us, where does this rank? Is this the top? And we can do this with a moderate or modest impact on the revenue, or is this going to be one of 10 things that have to be done? Because if it's that, then unfortunately, obviously, we have to draw a line through a bunch of things we're not going to want to do. Now, I think others have said that. That's the perspective which I personally share.
Thank you, Art. Okay, so what are there other comments from Derek or Kevin? I think everybody's had a chance. We appreciate very much. We've asked for, and now we've had our presentation honored. Thank you very much. I know we had you at a couple meetings, and again, very, very helpful to have you here. We have some work to do as a board with our Board of Finance, with the Board of Selectmen, and the priority and the timeline. So I think for this evening that was very helpful to do that, and we should move to our next agenda item.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me and
All right.
listening to the presentation.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Next up is the presentation by Fiduciary Investment Advisors. Tyler, I saw you on.
Great. Tom, I think you have our presentation, so if you can. Perfect. And I'll start on page 7. Just a reminder to the Board of Finance, you voted to move from the 457 and the 401A plan from Mass Mutual to ICMA per a pretty extensive RFP. The timing couldn't be more perfect in that Mass Mutual last Tuesday announced that they're exiting the retirement business, and they actually sold that Mass Mutual business to Empower. So worked out pretty well. Again, that you won't be going through another transition. I know this was initially a transition from Hartford to Mass Mutual, but the current menu is as what's required in part of this transition is a selection of the new investments and obviously taking advantage of the open architecture nature of the new ICMA platform, as well as some lower cost investment options. So this is the previous Mass Mutual fund menu. Again, the BNY Mellon index funds, a little bit higher cost than what's available in the open market. Some funds that we don't typically see in the menu designs, like a global bond fund, as well as some opportunity to further add indexing in different categories. So if you go to the next page, Tom, thank you. This is the proposed menu that came out of the retirement committee. A replacement of the stable value option. We can't actually get the general account through the ICMA platform, so we'd be offering the stable value option. A replacement of the index strategies. As you can see, Fidelity will now be the indexed provider versus BNY Mellon, reducing pretty significantly the cost to have access to the index funds. Additional index funds in the large value, mid value, small value, small growth, mid growth, and large growth space, and then adding an international index. But for the most part, the other active managers will remain the same, as well as the target date fund managers, but just at a lower cost. I'll pause there to see if there's any questions. I did include the following pages show just the mapping structure. So that's on page 9. Just shows you where the assets would move from one fund to another for the most part. As you'll note, the Western Asset Core bond will just lower its share class. MFS value will just lower its share class. For many of the funds, will just be a decrease in cost. We are replacing AllianceBernstein Discovery Value in favor of Vanguard Explorer Value from a performance standpoint. It was a fund that we thought we can get better value out of. And then for the rest of the funds are just lower share classes. The fees, I do show the performance, but again, for the most part, we're just adding the index strategies. I can show you what the fee comparisons look like on page 17. And I guess I'll just focus on the 457 plan. And kudos goes to the folks that were involved in the RFP process. But total cost previously was about $133,000 for both record keeping and investments. You can see the expense ratio there. Of that, $100,000 was going to Mass Mutual. This is just on the larger plan at 457 plan. If you go to the next page, you can see pretty significant reduction in overall cost, as well as a roughly $80,000 reduction in cost to the record keeping for the plan through ICMA without sacrifice in fees, or in services. So that's our recommendation. I'll open it up, see if there's any further questions, and then I guess pass it back.
And Tyler, this is Kevin. I want to appreciate going through the RFP, sitting down and taking the recommendations from the subcommittee by adding the additional indexed options within there. Appreciate all the work that you've done, and Maria and Amy as well.
Great, thank you. It's been great working with the team.
Great. So we had it all the way. We saw Mass Mutual. We knew what they were going to do, Tyler. We're all knowing.
Well, the writing was on the wall early on. It was
I know.
rumored Yeah, you're owners of your own destiny now, and you don't have to follow where the sale goes.
Right. Great, thank you. So Amy, do we need to take action on this tonight, or I thought we've already done this?
I think we have to make a motion to approve the recommendation of investment.
Okay, all right.
Right.
So looking for that, a motion to do that.
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
All in favor, are any questions or comments? All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
So that carries. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right.
Mr. Chairman, it's Chris Cashmar. Two quick items for the board's consideration.
Sure.
I promise if we, Tom, jump to page 25 in the presentation, just a recast of the investment policy statement. I think we talked with the subcommittee in our meeting just a short time ago that we had reaffirmed the larger investment policy statement construct and it being in good working order and didn't have any wholesale changes. The only thing that we did have for the board's consideration on page 26, you'll see there a recommendation to make very modest changes to the target weights, and those changes emanate from the previous approval from the board for eliminating Van Eck. So you'll remember Van Eck was a natural resources equity strategy that resided in the inflation protection portion of the program, decided to eliminate that. And we needed to find a home for those 1.5%, those 150 basis points. Analytically, that strategy was most akin and most correlated to domestic equities. So the recommendation here is a fairly small one, but I think a necessary one nonetheless, whereby we just take that 1.5%, it moves from inflation protection into the domestic equity category, and you see the small changes around the ranges as well. So fairly minor detail, but one that would just kind of complete administratively the change that this group had already endorsed.
And Chris, you feel comfortable with that, given the amount of M1 supply increase?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Kevin. Yeah, I think it's a relatively modest change from natural resource equities to domestic equities, right? This won't have any material effect on the return potential of the program, certainly in a large way. So yes, we're absolutely comfortable with it.
Okay, so we would need a motion to approve this slightly revised allocation table.
So moved.
Second. Seconded by Derek. All in favor, say aye. Question or any questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Lisa, you're on? Yep. I can't see everybody, so I have to, I'm reading lips. Okay. That it, Chris?
The last thing we had, Mr. Chairman, and I promise we'll be quick to the chase here on page 28. Again, at the subcommittee meeting, you'll see there an exhibit that shows the pension plan allocations as of the end of August. They're topical enough where the conversation can proceed in terms of a potential recommended course of action. We had talked with the subcommittee about the idea that as markets have evolved and as we're kind of constantly looking at opportunities on behalf of the plans and how to best position them to meet their return objectives over time, that periodically we'll have thoughts around sizing different managers. And in the past, as you all know, sometimes it's extended beyond that. We've in fact replaced managers altogether. But if you can make it out as highlighted in the upper right-hand corner of the exhibit here, you'll see that the proposal contemplates not eliminating, but reducing the Templeton Global Bond position from a 5% target to a 2.5% target, and those 250 basis points moving into the two anchor fixed income managers in the MetWest and Western. Again, relatively minor change, certainly not larger changes to the mix of equities versus fixed income or anything like that, a much smaller kind of orientation away from Templeton. And our thought there again is There are a couple pages, Tom, that we can probably highlight here. I don't want to run on too long, but if you jump ahead to page 31, just as a reminder for the committee, Templeton Global Bond is kind of a unique strategy in the international bond space. They do tether themselves predominantly to government bonds, as you can see there, as indicated in this summary. They do have a sensitivity and awareness to preserving capital, certainly, but a primary focus on growing their portfolios over time, of course, and having a very differentiated strategy. So they are one of the highest conviction managers that we work with. They are somewhat benchmark agnostic. What do I mean by that? They will look very different than the benchmark that we use to evaluate their performance over time. They run with very high conviction, and there will be points in time in their return cycle, when they struggle and when they could struggle on a go forward basis. You see here, starting on page 32, if you could, Tom, there's a lot of data here again, and I'll go through just a highlight or two, and then I'll pause, I promise, for questions. But you see here just that flavor for differentiation that I talked about. Upper right-hand corner of the page, global bonds have a duration or an interest rate sensitivity, a maturity, if you will, of somewhere between 9 and 10 years. Look at the position of the Templeton strategy. It's about a third of that. So very, very different in the way they run the portfolios. You see as you work your way down on the page in terms, if you can make it out, credit quality in the lower left-hand corner, the blue line being Templeton, the green lines being the index. Look how differentiated that positioning is. Look at the maturity differentiation in the lower right-hand corner of the page. If you jump, Tom, to page 33, you can see there on a regional and geographic basis, kind of how they position and how they kind of profile. The takeaway for us in working with our research staff is they continue, and we continue to like Templeton as a strategy. But on a go-forward basis, right, we may encounter these increased bouts of volatility. We know that interest rates around the world are very low. We know there's a degree of artificiality, perhaps in asset prices by virtue of all the stimulus that's been put into the system. And we're just more comfortable, and if you remember back to that first exhibit, of not eliminating but reducing the Templeton position a little bit as a result. So that was the proposition at the subcommittee meeting. I know there were some questions around the why for that. I'm hoping tonight we gave you a little bit of a summary flavor for some of the whys on that. But again, I'll pause here and see what folks think about the idea if there's still lingering questions.
I had a quick question for you. Did you look at Vanguard as a comparison or Fidelity? I know Kevin.
Yeah, the global, they don't really have very adequate global bond indexed mandates, right? If you do a global bond index mandate, you're going to get a lot of that interest rate sensitivity that I showed you in those statistics. This is an area we think that if you're going to have a commitment in the space, it should be active, and there should be a pretty big toolbox. So I don't know, Lisa, a lot of the conviction around holding Templeton in the program is that differentiated approach, right? And that high conviction approach. It's not so much, it's to a lesser extent global bonds as an asset class, if that makes sense. So we're aware of them and we do look at them, but if our recommendation to this group that is, if you're going to have a position in global bonds, it should be done with an active manager.
Does the performance warrant it, Chris?
So if you look, Kevin, I didn't include it here because I know we've looked at it a bunch of times. So the Templeton team that runs this strategy has been in place since 2005. If you go back and look at their track record over those 15 calendar years ending in 2019, the fund has been in the top decile of its peer group in 10 of those 15 years. we happen to be in a period in 19 and in the first 2/3 of 2020 where some of their positioning has been out of favor. I would tell you, Kevin, that net of fees, long-term investors in the strategy, if they've been able to kind of stomach some of the volatility that kind of falls out of that high conviction differentiated approach, have earned incremental returns net of the Templeton fee. But it can be, as we've seen and talked about, right, a little bit of a roller coaster. So again, it comes back to this idea that we Lisa, to your question, active in the space where just from a sizing perspective, the strategy can be somewhat more volatile. And if you look at the landscape again, just where interest rates are and this potential for these elevations in capital market volatility over the next couple of years, that we think more thoughtfully sizing that position down a little bit makes kind of eminent sense.
Do you have a comparison though, like to a Vanguard fund that's not actively managed in terms of performance during the same time period?
Well, I told you, you would use, what I would tell you is that you would look at WGBI, the Global Bond Index, as a comparative. I don't have those numbers in this deck, but as I mentioned to Kevin, if you looked over long periods of time, Templeton would have outpaced that index net of fees.
Okay.
Again, I can follow up with the board on some of this additional information if you'd like to see it. It's not in the deck tonight, though.
Okay, so we need to approve that those recommended changes. Chris?
I would, Mr. Chairman, say, yeah, consider them, and that would be a recommendation to the group, yes.
So it's our advisor's recommendation. It's the recommendation of the subcommittee, Kevin, that we make these changes?
Correct.
All right. So why don't you make the motion or somebody make the motion?
Motion is moved to accept fiduciary's recommendations.
Okay. You want to second that?
Cool.
All right. So Art's seconded. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Okay. All right. So that passes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the members of the board. That's all I think Tyler and I had for you this evening.
Great. Well, I should have started by saying, okay, go
I
ahead.
just had one follow-up that was with Amy. I think one of the, Lisa and I, one of our recommendations from the subcommittee was to make sure that the participants were automatically enrolled. I don't know if there's been any feedback from that.
Yeah, so I know Maria looked into that. If she wants to just pop on quick, and I know we had somebody looking into that. I know she's available in here.
Yeah, Kevin, we are looking into that for you. And as soon as I have a good answer, I'll make sure to get back to you all with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Of course, no problem.
So the last thing was I was going to thank Chris and Tyler for sitting through the first part of our meeting. You guys got pushed down. We won't try not to do that too often. I know the sheer entertainment value of these meetings was worth the wait, though. So,
Tyler was going to put a pitch into the town, Mr. Chairman, on that property that was open.
Yeah, exactly. Would love to have your contributions. Thanks very much. All right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it very much. Okay. Amy, have we done fiscal 19 and 20 year-end financial results as part of the fund transfer? Or?
No, we haven't done that. So I know I'm typically a little long-winded, and I know we're getting to like 8 o'clock. So do you want me to go through my presentation, or did you want me to just take questions based on the agenda summary?
The latter, if we could, if that's okay with the members. And I was pretty much okay with all of this. I know that Lisa, did you have some questions? I'm sure.
Hi, I'm not sure about that comment.
Yeah.
I did have a few questions. First of all, Amy, thank you for your work on that. I really appreciate it. One thing that struck me as sort of curious is we had almost 1.4 million in savings from personnel costs. And I know that, sometimes it's hard to hire during COVID, but that struck me as a very large number. And I was wondering what was behind that.
Yeah, sure. So, if I can, let me see if I can, I wouldn't bother. So when I was going through it, even if you look through the statement of the expenditures, there's really nothing like on the revenue side, you can see some things that really kind of pop out at you. They're like, oh, well, that makes up the 1.4 million. On the expenditure side, it was a little different. I mean, we had like $100,000 here, a couple $100,000 there. We had some additional COVID expenditures. We had the legal that was over budget. So there wasn't anything that kind of like stuck out like, oh my God, that's some major savings. It really was just a conglomerate of events that happened in the salaries and benefits. So there was vacancies in the police department. We had vacancies in planning. We had vacancies in engineering, library, dispatch, the assessor's office, finance, and buildings and maintenance. And it ranged from anything from retirements to lags in hiring, staffing transitions, the elections budget alone, due to the cancellation of the referendum, we didn't have to pay any of the poll workers. The highway had overtime savings from a mild winter. The police department had savings from their seasonal workers because of the school closing, so we didn't have to pay the crossing guards. And then earlier, like I mentioned, we had various unsettled union contracts that, although it appears they're savings, they will have to pay out in fiscal year 21. So I think that covers the majority.
Okay, thank you for that update. I was just, I've never seen a number that big, so it is highly unusual, and I don't want the
It is.
And one might say, and that was helpful to have that explanation, because without that explanation, you might think perhaps we over budgeted and we've identified non-essential folks. So I just want to clarify your explanation, make sure that gets in the minutes, because that's an important distinction. I also wanted to point out, I saw that our health insurance, we transferred a lot of money in there, and now we're at 30% reserves, and our target is 20 to 25. So that's a little bit shocking. I assume part of that's people weren't doing voluntary surgeries and stuff like that.
Right, so that's accurate. And we actually just had a meeting with our benefits consultants the other day, which I'll touch on in a second. But yes, there was a significant decrease in claims compared to what we had budgeted for the year. There was people that put off elective surgeries, people that didn't go to the doctors because of COVID, dentist offices were closed. So we definitely saw a decrease in claims coming in during the majority of the COVID months. And now as things are starting to reopen, we do think that there will be an uptick in fiscal year 21 to kind of offset that savings that we did have in fiscal year 20. So right now our reserve is about, I thought I noted it, it was about 29% of expected claims. So the target is 20 to 25%, but because we don't know what's going to happen in fiscal year 20 with the uptick, we would like to keep that in there until we see how fiscal year 21 plays out. But some interesting news that I kind of wanted to share that our benefits consultant shared with us is related to COVID claims. We were actually, we had the least amount of COVID claims impact to our fund compared to all of our other peers. We had the lowest impact out of the state of Connecticut, our peers, and their other towns that they represent. So I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Rob, I also have a few capital questions. I don't know if we're ready to move on to those, or you want me to just get them out of the way.
Keep going.
All right, I'm going. One of the things that struck me is as I look at sort of completed projects and some of these, it looks like we estimated more than we needed by close to $1 million. And so that goes back to my sort of conversation. How are we doing our estimating, and is there a way to adjust for that or get more accurate? And there may not be, but I think it's a question worth at least looking at. I did have a question on there's one project from fiscal year 10 that's due to be completed in fiscal year 21. That's a sewer thing. And you probably don't have that right now, but I'd be curious as to why that's taking 11 years. For the fiscal year 13 project, you have an ongoing town security measures. And I went back and looked in my book and I couldn't even find that. And I wasn't sure what you meant by ongoing. So if you could clarify that.
Let me just write down. So the one for project 2010 to follow up on.
Yeah, just to sort of get an understanding why some of these are taking so long. It may be that it has to do with grant funding. I don't know, but that's just asking about the outliers. And the fiscal year 13 under town projects, the first one, it says ongoing, but I couldn't find that in my budget book. So perhaps it was done, ad hoc at a meeting. But I just wasn't sure what that was and why it would be listed as ongoing from fiscal year 13 as opposed to.
So when I started, I actually looked at all the capital projects and traced them back to the original appropriations. I don't have my capital book with me, but I'll definitely get those documents and I can send them along afterwards tomorrow.
Okay. And then, so one more. And then, those 365. The town hall site and safety improvements. I know that a lot had not been spent, but we're anticipating that will be done in December 2020. And I was wondering if that includes paving of the parking lot, because at the time we approved it, I thought it did. I knew it originally approved a new configuration for entering the parking lot, and I assumed that included paving, but could I get clarification on that? Because I know you have paving town hall scheduled for next year, so I just wanted to understand what's being done under that project.
Okay, yeah,
I could speak to that a bit if that's helpful. So I believe that project, I think Lisa, was appropriated, it might have been fiscal 16, 17 or 17, 18.
Yes. 16, 17, yes.
Yes, and it was appropriated prior to any design being done on that. But we have recently, Jeff Shea is the lead on that, and our internal traffic authority team is assigned to that project. That includes the chief, our public works director, our planning director, and myself. So that project will be a combination of paving part of that parking lot. It'll be reconfiguring the entryways, as well as trying to work on some of the crosswalk, the mid-block crossings that are in front of town hall to make those more safe as well. Because it's a state road, it also involves working with the state DOT in terms of, again, where our curb cuts will be and where we're going to place the crosswalks and things of that nature. So we've got a pretty good, I think, design that's been complete at this point, and we're hoping to at least start with phase 1 of construction this fiscal year.
Okay, thank you. I know that was a priority when we passed it. So, sometimes I wonder, I know sometimes you have to pass a project and then it takes time to get it going because you have to do the studies first, but I would just go back to our recommendation request last budget cycle that we sort of look at the timing as to when we think these projects are going to be completed when we pass them, and what's the capacity for staff to actually work on the projects each year, because we may be able to spread some of these out and sort of help with the capital squeeze by sort of doing a more thorough evaluation there, or at least it's worth considering. So I just put that out there. That's all I have, Rob.
Perfect. Anybody else? Questions, comments? All right, so we don't need to do anything with this information. It just, okay. All right.
No, that's not true. You need to approve my general fund budget transfers. Hold on, I can.
So we didn't do that earlier?
No. You approved the general fund transfers, but there's one that you have to do for the audit. If you take a look at the screen, you'll see that this was our original budget, which is also our final budget.
Okay.
These are our actuals, and then to get to a balance of 0, it's just a report that goes in the audit, but you need to approve it.
Okay, so if you look at the submission, it's the motion on number 4. To approve the schedule, and the schedule is all of these things in this memo?
It's just what's on my screen right now.
Okay.
So Amy, this doesn't include the transfers that we approved earlier?
No, those will go in afterwards. So this is just approving, tying up the final budget to the adjusted budget, and then send it along to the auditors. I'll include those transfers as well.
Okay.
I'll move that then.
And I need a second.
Second.
Any questions or comments? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All right, passes unanimously. All right, good. And then the finance director's report.
Yes. So you have your standard updated listing of grants and donations. Under the COVID update, I just wanted to let you know about some additional funding that's becoming available from the state of Connecticut. So if you had watched in the news, they let everybody know that there's going to be a second round of CARES funding related to the Board of Education side. And originally we had been given estimates of about $464,000 or something of that nature. Unfortunately, they made an error in their calculations, and so they gave us a revised estimate of $292,000 that we should be receiving for expenditures from now until the end of December. We also received some additional notification related to grant funding for assistance with the upcoming elections. And we can expect to receive about $13,000 on the town side to help support those costs. Going to the town COVID-19 impact update, I don't think there was anything really major that changed here. After we had made our major bulk purchases, things have kind of really slowed down for the town. But if you take a look at the Board of Education COVID impact, you'll see that this keeps going up. So at the end of fiscal year 20, nothing's changed from the last report. There is still some overall savings. But in fiscal year 21, we're about $825,000 into this year with COVID expenditures in order to meet the technology needs for distance learning, the ventilation needs for the schools, just getting everybody set up in either a hybrid model, everybody gets their own Chromebooks, things of that nature. So these were the dollars that we were looking to offset when you all approved that transfer for the Board of Ed to keep their savings. So they have some CARES money from this year that we should be receiving soon. We have that second appropriation that the state is sending for the $292,000. We have the savings that you all approved, and then we also have $385,000 in the non-lapsing. So as of right now, we're still in an okay position. We won't be using all of the non-lapsing. There will be about $160,000 left. So even though our expenditures are pretty great at this point related to COVID, we are in a pretty good position. We shouldn't need any additional appropriations at this point.
Amy, when you do your next presentation, can you sort of put those in a fiscal note or like sources that we anticipate filling the gap with so that we can sort of keep track of where we think that's going to go?
Just like a breakdown of where the revenue offsets are?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And then on the town side, I didn't see anything, and maybe you have it in part-time, but town clerk, I assume with the absentee ballots, they've got more people working. I saw an email from Karen and Susan Selena. So is that in the part-time when you describe expenditure, or do we detail it outside?
Oh, I included it as part of the election supplies, I think initially, but actually should be updated based on where we ended up since this report was done last week. So I'll update that for next time as well.
Okay. Thank you. I think just the citizens may be interested in especially how we're spending on elections this year.
Yeah, it's definitely a change.
All right.
Go ahead.
Great. Awesome. No action necessary. And so then the minutes, approval of the minutes. Again, long meeting, lots of good summaries there, Karen. Appreciate it. I didn't have anything material. Did anyone have anything? All right, let's approve the minutes.
So moved.
Seconded by Art. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, unanimous. And Amy is again providing us with the updates on the building, and we had two correspondences, letters from the Simsbury Soccer Club and Simsbury Youth Lacrosse. And then there was a further communication that I think was shared yesterday relative to the Meadowood project. So I just want to make sure everybody got those and read those. All right. We didn't make my 7:30 target. We didn't make my 7:45 target. We didn't make my 8 o'clock final target. But we did pretty well today. We covered a lot of ground. All right. Good meeting.
I'll make a motion, but I just want to make sure I thank Karen again for providing great minutes and being able to withstand the exciting conversations that we have.
You're welcome.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, guys. Good meeting.